to the computer.
There we go.
Welcome to Moore's Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is A'Jamal Byndon, and with me in the studio today is Dr. Abby Carbaugh, who is a community person who specializes in data. Her PhD is in criminal justice, and she's worked in helping deconstruct numbers as well as issues related to research in the criminal justice system. We are aware that there is a disconnect between the academic community and research and grass tops in Nebraska dealing with research. Frantz Fanon once said that the burden of accountability is to involve the masses in changing the systems. And so that's one of the issues we're involved in. We're interested in more in dealing with race and ethnicity and disparities with people of color. Dr. Carbaugh has shared her paper written by her and her colleagues a number of years ago that clearly outlines and defines some of the challenges of what about reporting the race in the media. The paper can also help folks to see bias, implicit bias, and just racism in reporting in the local press and nationally. In my reading of the paper, there were many questions that came into consideration related to her data as well as racial disparities and discrimination. And the paper is called Depictions, I can't even say it right, of female offenders in front page news stories, the importance of race and ethnicity by Pauline Brigham and then Abby Carbaugh, who wrote this probably at least 8 years ago. So we want to invite her on to talk a little about that. So Abby, can you first share a little bit more about yourself with the viewing audience?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, A'Jamal. I'm really happy to be doing this interview with you. So I am currently the data administrator for Douglas County's Juvenile Justice Initiative. And prior to that, I was the research director for the state prison system. So my areas of research are really primarily in the areas of corrections. The practical work is looking at what brings people into the system, how long are they staying involved, and then are the programs and services that we have available effective in getting them shortening their length of stay and then keeping them from coming back once they're released. And then the work that I've done previously is looking at media depictions of offenders and specifically how women are presented in terms of their race and ethnicity. So a little bit all over the board, but it all blends together.
Now, can you provide just an overview of this study, kind of a synopsis of what the study is about?
Yeah, so in this study, my professor Pauline Brennan and I, we looked at the New York Times and the LA Times. And what we wanted to do is to see how are newspaper reporters writing stories about women who commit crimes. And really what we wanted to know is, are there differences in how these women are portrayed based on their race and their ethnicity? And so we gathered stories from the New York Times and from the LA Times, and we coded all of the stories that we found on the front pages to see, what explanations are being given for why these women commit their crimes, how are they being described, and then also we looked at physically where are these articles appearing on the front page of the newspaper, just to kind of get that visual salience measure to see how quickly is this going to catch the reader's attention. And so what we found is that the portrayals of women of color were much more negative than the stories about white women. And this was true even when we controlled for things such as what type of offense was committed, how many victims were involved. And then again, we were using newspapers on both coasts. And so again, with that geography coming into play, it really didn't make much of a difference.
Now, I know that you use both the New York Times and Los Angeles Times. Why not use the Omaha World Herald, since we have clear examples of bias in terms of reporting about people of color?
Sure. So we use the New York Times and the LA Times because they are nationally available newspapers. So it doesn't matter if I'm in New York or if I'm in LA, if I'm walking through an airport in Omaha, if I'm walking down the street in Chicago, if I'm looking at a newsstand pretty much anywhere, there's a good chance that I'm going to see one of those two papers. So we looked at those two because they are they're the primary newspapers, not only in those areas, but they also have a wide national distribution. So this study was a paper that I worked on as part of my undergraduate thesis project. And I continued this work when I was working on my master's thesis. And so for that one, we did expand. And so we coded stories from Minneapolis, Chicago, Omaha, and Houston to get that more national representation and to see maybe there's something different in the way these stories are written based on geography. And what we found was that there really wasn't much difference. It didn't matter where you go in the country. The stories about women of color are typically much more negative than the stories about white women.
Right. Now, I noticed that there's this concept of media tend to report women as victims, particularly white women. How is that determined for the tool in measuring that concept? How do you come to that tool in measuring white women as victims?
Yeah, so even though we're looking at the offenders in this story, we did want to sort of assess maybe how these women may have been portrayed as victims of the system, or victims of uh, a male criminal in their life. So they're just sort of a partner in crime. And so what we did is we used the framework of techniques of neutralization. And this is from sort of the early days of criminology. So I think it was around the mid 1960s, the first study about this came out. And that study was looking specifically at delinquent boys. And so it was saying when we're looking at juvenile offenders and how they're rationalizing their actions and the crimes that they commit, how does that happen? And so what we did is we took that techniques of neutralization framework and we thought, okay, well, if this is how individuals, if these are the explanations individuals are using to rationalize their own behaviors, is this going to show up in media stories when we have journalists writing about other people? How do these things come into play to explain the offenses of others? And so we found these techniques of neutralization were much more prevalent in the stories about white women. And so what that means is that the white women, the stories presented a lot more information that was included to excuse or to minimize their behaviors. And those were not present in the stories to the same degree for women of color.
Now, in the study, I noticed that you mentioned of females on death row. Why is that important in the study?
Yeah, so that's important for this study because when we think about people on death row in general, they've done something incredibly heinous to get there. So not only was the crime itself inherently bad, but also there were enough aggravating circumstances around it that the only suitable punishment the court could see was death. So the death penalty, to get the death penalty, you got to do something that's really bad. But we also know that women are treated much more leniently in the criminal justice system and in society in general than men are. So in order for a woman to be on death row, not like there's even a higher threshold that she has to meet in order to be placed there. So when we were doing this study, we wanted to take that into consideration to see if we have women who have met that bar and they've gone over and above that threshold, even controlling for this terrible thing that they've done, are there still differences in how these women are portrayed based on their race and ethnicity? So are white women on death row portrayed more positively than Black or Latino women on death row?
Now, I noticed that you also talk about a concept called evil women, as opposed to mad and sad women. Explain those concepts to our viewing audience.
Yeah, so these are some concepts that have come up in research prior to ours that we saw replicated in the stories that we read. And so really what it builds on is the idea of a woman being evil is kind of stems from not only are her actions bad, but then how much else is she breaking stereotypical gender norms? So when we see stories about bad women, those are women who are described as being bad mothers, who are being described as bad wives. In some of the stories, it talks about women whose houses are just dirty. And so, she's just a bad housekeeper. And so she's violating all of these standards that we think of when we think of traditional femininity. And so, again, those were much more prevalent in stories about women of color than they were in stories about white women. The stories about white women focused a lot more on this idea of mental illness to mitigate their actions, or the idea that, we need to have pity for these women because there were so many other things going on in their life. So one of the stories that comes to mind that we looked at was the story of Andrea Yates. And she was a woman who drowned 5 of her children in the bathtub. And so that right there is breaking sort of the most egregious act of gender stereotypes. So not only is this woman killing her children, but it's done in a very violent way, and she killed multiple children. But the stories about her were focused on her mental illness and used the mental illness to explain her actions. But then there were also other just other mitigating things that were kind of thrown in the story. And so in a couple of the articles, it talked about the clothes that she was wearing, and it talked about how she was sitting with her hands crossed at the defense table. So, you know, kind of this shirking woman concept. And then there was at least one article that talked about her husband being present in the courtroom and being there as an emotional support system. So again, she committed the worst crime that you can as a woman, and by killing her children. But the father of these children, her husband, was right there by her side showing. So if he can show support for her, then as a reader, how can we not also do the same? That's really the implication that the story left us with, you know, as opposed to, you know, a story about a Black woman who shoplifted, and it talks about her drug addiction and, you know, her history of theft and all of this other things that are just, she's just inherently bad. And so there really is that dichotomy that we saw play out in our research that just supported the findings and some of the terminology from previous research.
Mhm. As you mentioned, that story comes to mind because I remember one of my colleagues was talking about I think the woman in the bathtub. There was postpartum depression happens when women have children, and so she had shared with her husband that if I start acting this way, you need to pull me out of it. But again, it is a phenomenon sometimes when people feel depressed after having a baby, particularly after euphoria of having a baby. So that was an issue. Also, we'll go back to the concept you call mad, sad women. And I just recently learned the term mean girls. I used to call them bad girls. Then somebody corrected me and says, no, there's a difference with somebody who's a mean girls because they gang up on people. And it's kind of a different concept that I didn't know about until recently. But it's something that deals with office politics sometimes. And people are just mean to each other and do that. So it was just fascinating to hear the word bad girls or bad women versus mean girls or something like that. I got a question. The question I would come back to is, why is ethnicity and race so important in our studies? And do we have a colorblind media system? Because people tend to act like we do, particularly those who, talk this fair and unbiased reporting. But from your vantage point, why is race and ethnicity important in this study? And then do we have a unbiased media from your vantage point?
Yeah, so I don't think we have an unbiased media, because even in this study, when we looked at the stories, we controlled for geography and we controlled for the types of offenses that these women committed, and we controlled for as many factors as we could in the stories. Now, that's not to say that there weren't stories about women of color that were framed positively, and there were still some stories about white women that were written, that left the readers with a very negative impression. But overall, we saw the same themes and the same stereotypes playing out throughout the articles, and they played out in a consistent way across the country. And so really, I think, part of the reason that happens is news reporters are people, and as people, we bring our own inherent biases into any situation. But then it's exacerbated in the media because at the end of the day, media is a business. And it's in the business to sell, and it's in the business to be the first one to break a story. And how do you do that? You can do that by being sensational. And by being sensational in very subtle ways, I think is a dangerous concept, because that's how we wind up with stories like these, right? We wind up with people in similar circumstances, but because of this one thing about them, because of the color of their skin or because of their nationality, we find that the stories about them are being told in vastly different ways. And those ways are extremely damaging because as readers, if we're not going through a data set and coding out these stories, we may not realize just these subtle cues and how they're different based on who the offender is, or more specifically, what the offender looks like.
Now, in your study, I know that you had again, you alluded to this hideous crimes, and you talked about these examples. And again, one of the things I wanted to talk to or share, or have you share is uh, even the crimes that were, I would call that were white collar crimes are hideous crimes. There were bias in both of those situations between white collar criminals who were white women or people of color, women, African American, versus the more hideous one. Did you see them in both areas in your study?
Yeah, so in this study, we coded, I think it was around 53, 54 different articles that we found. And so about half of them, half of the stories were on violent crimes and half of them weren't, and that's just how it worked out. But we did see the same things. We saw that it didn't really matter what type of crime was written about in the article. Black women were portrayed more negatively than white women for violent crimes or for nonviolent crimes. And so one of the examples that I think we talked about, I don't remember if we talked about it in this paper or if we talked about it in my thesis, but there was a white woman who was embezzling, and she had stolen, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the stories about her were written pretty favorably, or at least very neutrally.
Right.
And so, the stories talked about, well, yeah, she took this much money, but to mitigate her actions or neutralize her actions, it was, but the company made so much other money. So it really, in the grand scheme of things, this didn't really hurt any people. It didn't really, affect the business. It was just, she made a mistake. And then in contrast, we had we had a story about a Black woman who was, I think it was a malfeasance of office, or it was more of abuse of a political role type of situation was her sort of white collar offense. But she appeared on the front page, I think it was the Houston Chronicle, for multiple weeks. And the story just dragged out about her. And it was, it was just her violation of the public trust. And how could she do this to the people who voted her into office? And she must just be an inherently bad person. How could we ever trust her? And so even within white collar crimes, we're seeing this difference where the primary thing that's different in these articles is the skin color of the woman, but all of the details that are included about the offenses and about who these women are outside of their jobs and outside of their crime are vastly different, just based on the color of her skin.
Mhm. Now, what is the difference benefit of committing the crime in terms of benefit others? And one of the concepts I've used is, does it mean there's one still and feed your family, the crime, or one who does it in terms of just to make more money or something of that nature? And I use the term Robin Hood, meaning that sometimes when people commit a crime to do something to help others, people look at it differently. So my question to you is, in your studies and what you worked on, did you look in terms of the type of crime, whether it was to help the family or whatever, or just people who were stealing things? Were there bias in terms of how we perceive that or how it was reported by the media?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that we coded for. We did look to see to the degree that we could figure it out from the stories and that we could code for it, what are the circumstances surrounding the offense? So were there elements of mental illness at play? Was this sort of something that a woman was doing for survival? So we talked about the techniques of neutralization earlier. Well, the other thing that we looked at was the flip side of it, and we called them exacerbators. So if, one of the techniques of neutralization is the denial of injury. And so, maybe somebody committed a crime, but, like especially with white collar crime, yeah, I might have stolen some money, but, it's from the larger company. They didn't really need that money anyway, so they're not really hurting by my actions. We also coded for the opposite of that. And so we looked to see, okay, are there descriptions of real injury in this story? And so again, going back to that example I had from the Houston articles about the woman in office, when it was talking about, the violation of trust and how her actions were just so negatively affected the public, that story really emphasized that, hey, her actions caused injury to a lot of people. And even though that injury is more sort of esoteric and it's that loss of public trust, that's a big thing for a political leader. And so we did look to see what are the circumstances surrounding it. And again, that kind of plays back into that whole bad woman versus sad woman kind of thing. are these just inherent flaws that this is a terrible person, or are there circumstances surrounding the event that we need to take into account that can help explain how somebody wound up in those situations?
Mhm. Defined by this concept you use in your paper called techniques of neutralization, which is kind of a complex word for some of us to discern or whatever. But what does that really mean?
Yeah, for sure. So the techniques of neutralization are just ways that people, it's just how do we look at a situation and try to minimize the actions, or how do we neutralize a bad thing that we've done so that, so that it takes away that concept that we are bad people. So, if my actions don't hurt anybody, then yeah, maybe I did a bad thing, but I'm not a bad person, or, that it wasn't really as bad as I thought it was. So it's a way to try to explain and rationalize what happened and make it not so bad.
Now, one of the problems we face in the community is the lack of reporters reporting on real news. I mean, I see them do these internet news reports that we've already read on the internet, and they're repeats. What is reformation or reform thought and disengage in terms of reform? You talked about that in your paper about how we can deal with some of this process, that we can help deal with some real news of the topics that you alluded to. So what does that really mean when you talk about reforming our news or dealing with it in a much more holistic manner?
Yeah, so that was a concept that we came across as we were going through and coding these articles, and we were kind of we were a little unsatisfied as we were going through, because we were coding these articles and we felt like there was just something else that was missing, and there was something important that we couldn't pick out. And so finally one night we were sitting there and we're like, I think we figured out what it is. And we called it reformation through disengagement. And so this was just another new sort of technique of neutralization that we noticed journalists using. And really what it was, and I don't remember, I think it was it Squeaky Frome? I think she was one of
Right?
the
With the
one with Charles
Manson case,
Manson.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there were a handful of stories when we were going through that were about her, and the stories about her were written again from sort of that sad lens, and it wasn't even the sad lens, but they were positive. And we figured out that the reason that we were coming away from those articles, feeling kind of good about this woman who had done terrible things, was because the stories were highlighting how much distance there was between her, who she is now, and who she was at the time of the crime. And so we call it this idea of reformation through disengagement, is the fact that even if a woman does something terrible, there's a possibility for her to be able to redeem herself through the media by showing, I'm not doing that anymore, or there's been so much time that's elapsed, I've gone through programming, treatment, and whatever. And so we saw this with some of the other women involved in drug stories and stories about drug abuse, and some horrific crimes that women had committed while they were under the influence of substances. And again, it's that idea of, okay, now that they're sober, now that they've gone through treatment programs, they've turned this corner in their life, and they're a completely different person. We can't hold them to the same standard. So that was something that was very interesting to us, because again, we saw that play out much more in stories for white women, whereas in stories for the women of color, we were seeing sort of again, it's the opposite of it. We saw these stories continue to reiterate just the bad things that they had done. So continued histories of drug abuse, or, a relapse was framed as just, oh, she's never going to change. There was this element of hopelessness, and it was so frustrating to read.
Mhm. Now, is it possible your study or report could help improve the coverage of the local media, and particularly as they report on news and crime studies dealing with women in our community, if reporters or news editors understood and discerned it and read it? So is that one of the implications of this study, or could that help them to address some of the bias in the media?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. One of the things I think is important is for journalists and for editors just to be more cognizant of what they're publishing. And, they're probably not going through their own data set and coding all of their articles to see what
Right.
the content is. But again, we talked about earlier just those subtle cues that come through in stories, and just that sort of subtle element of racism in terms of how we portray people differently when they've committed the same crimes, they're in the same geographical region, the only difference is the color of their skin. That has such wide-reaching effects and such, again, it's that subliminal thing that if you're not consciously making yourself aware of it, you're not even realizing those stereotypes are continuing to be reinforced. So absolutely, I hope editors and I hope journalists read our study and read other studies that have been done before and since then, to be more aware of how they're presenting stories.
You know, as you were talking, and we're focused on women and women of color. Would this report have been different had we focused on men of color and white men, or is that replicated? Do you know anything that's done like this in terms of looking at gender issues? Because you're particularly looking at women only. But number one is, why did you look at women versus men? And then number two, what would be the difference if, I'm again speculating here, but if you would have did something on men or whatever?
Yeah. So the reason that we looked at women in the first place is just because there's sort of a gap in the literature surrounding women in the criminal justice system overall. And it's just there's fewer of them. They're not involved in the system as much, and they have a much different set of needs. They come with much more extensive trauma histories, and they require different approaches to address their needs, their risks, all of those sorts of things. So there was just this gap in the literature that we wanted to fill. To your question, if we were to do this study with males, I don't think we would see much difference. I think we'd see a lot more stories about men, just because there's more crime committed by men, and they get reported on more often. But I think we'd see the same racial and ethnic differences.
Right. I wish there was more studies similar to this one. How can we increase the number of studies like this in the academic institution? Because one of the things that I've noticed locally, particularly in Nebraska, is there are very few academic studies coming out of the various departments that deal with race and ethnicity, and particularly bias. And oftentimes, Abby, people act like they're afraid to talk about racial issues, particularly in the academic community. But how can we increase the modality or the frequency of people using studies similar to yours in our community? And what would suggest you have to do that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things. So one, I don't think that we have a lack of research in the area. I think there's a lot of research that's going on in terms of racial and ethnic biases in the criminal justice system, in the media, just across all areas of life. So I don't think that there is a lack of research being done, but I think you're right. I think where we do have an issue is figuring out how to get that information into the hands of people who can use it, and how to get the information out there. It is uncomfortable talking about race. I was certainly uncomfortable when I first was doing these studies, because how could I be racist? How could I have preconceived notions? And I had to confront some very uncomfortable things. And I still confront uncomfortable things, but I realized I have to put myself in the position to do that. And I have to get comfortable being uncomfortable if I'm going to be able to help make any real change. And so I think that what we need to do is, we have the Juvenile Justice Institute through UNL, and we have the Nebraska Center for Justice Research through UNO. They do a lot of really great studies on the criminal justice system, and they do a lot of studies through racial and ethnic lenses. And I know that they publish a lot of research on their websites, and they get it into the hands of agencies and organizations that they work with, that they get data from and study. And so then I think it's how do we get it out to people? I think one of the first steps is you bringing me into here. I think this is a great opportunity for me to make connections and to figure out how I can fit within the social landscape and use some of my skills and my background to put this work into action, and to figure out how we can take the research that we're doing and then figure out the why do we care, the now what. So now that we know something, we have an obligation to do something about it and to make it better. So it's taking that next step forward.
You know, as you alluded to, that reminds me more. We did an interview with child welfare, foster ombudsman, and then the inspector general, or the person who deals with prison. And I noticed when they were talking to the community folks, they had a different way of talking. it's very important to be able to deconstruct your reports or what you do to have, number one, a racialized lens, but also a grassroots lens where people can understand what you're saying, because oftentimes these bureaucrats or these individuals are used to talking to state senators or functionaries in departments, and they don't necessarily talk to the very victims or people in our system who needs to help clean it up. So there's a way that you talk to people where you can break it down, as I use the word, make it plain, as Malcolm used to say. So it's very important to do that. But more than anything is, Abby, getting the very people who would be the beneficiary of these changes at the table so that they can make sense of it and be proper advocates at different levels. And I'm not just talking about one body of government, but it could be administrators, it could be anyone who has this racialized data that shows a clear unfair treatment. So very important for us to do that. And then the other thing I think is important is not everybody look at your web page, but they may look at you when you do a community forum or Facebook Live, or you have someone like the Wise One or people in our community who bring you into these conversations to say, hey, what do you mean by that? And how can we run with that? And then what is the data saying, particularly in terms of our system that has an inordinate amount of kids or adults in system based on the race or geography, longer sentence and so on. But it's very important to have the conversation because, again, we don't know what we don't know, and we have to have a mirror in front of us sometime to be able to see what other people can see all the time. And systems don't always do that well. So appreciate that. One of the things I was going to ask you is, what are some of the future research areas that you might be working on or looking at in terms of that? And also, who can help carry this racialized data in diverse cities in Omaha or Lincoln or wherever, or in our state? So 2 questions there. What are some things you're working on in a sense, and who can help carry the torches, we would say, on helping us to move this needle forward so we become much more eclectic in dealing with racialized issues?
Yeah, so I think in terms of future research, there's a lot of different areas to cover, but that race and ethnicity component needs to be front and center. And I mentioned that, I had to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I think that when we're looking at data and when we're working with data, we have to use it for a couple of reasons. I think the first one is that, we have our gut reactions of what we know and how we know how the world works. But we need to put the numbers behind it to actually make sense of, is that truly what we know? Is what we perceive reality, or is it not? So the first step is just getting data together on the system to see if what we think is happening is what's actually happening, and just challenging some of those preconceived notions that we have. And then the second step to that is, because we have to know what's going on, and we have to care about it, because if we just bury our head in the sand and say, well, I don't think I'm going to be comfortable, or I'm not going to like what I see, that's not a reason to ignore it. It's actually all the more reason that we have to take a look at it. And because there could be really valid reasons for what we're seeing. And so just because something is a disparity doesn't inherently mean that it's a bad thing. And I think that's where JJI and CJR come into play is, they have the resources at their disposal to do a lot of that research, to work with community partners to figure out what are the areas in our community that we're missing. And then who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to make those connections with to get the information out to the people who can use it?
Now, one of the things that I think it helps us a little bit is we're concerned about making sure that we deal with issues related to race and ethnicity and table talk type events, and again, just getting people to have that. And one of the questions I was going to ask you in terms of this study, if you had to replicate it again, let's say this was done almost 8 years ago or close to that, would it say the same things based on what you're seeing going on today in our society from your vantage point?
And this is going to be pure speculation on my part, but yeah, I think it would. I think it would show the same trends, but I think it would be even more blatant, and
Oh,
I think it
wow.
would be even more divisive, because again, we're dealing with social media platforms. This study is from, I think, 2009, so we certainly didn't have social media to the extent that we do today. We also have, people are a lot busier. We have phones at our fingertips. And so the way that news is presented and the way that we consume media is changed a lot. So it has to be done much quicker sound bites. It has to be, just an eye-catching picture as we're scrolling through our news feeds to get our attention. And so I think we would see the same findings in terms of the white women being portrayed more positively than women of color. But I think it would be even more dichotomous.
Right. We're down to kind of our last question or comment. And one of the things I like to leave with our viewers is an opportunity for the guests to have any closing comments or things that you think you'd like to share with the viewing audience. Abby?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on the show. And then thank you for having me go back and look at the study again. It's been quite a long time since I looked at this. So after I finished my master's thesis, I shifted my focus more towards institutional corrections, and that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And so I kind of got onto a new track of research. But coming back to this it was fun to come back to it and to remember just the process of going through that study and remembering what we had found. But then also it was a good reminder for me to keep me grounded in the fact that even though I'm on a different track or a different focus of research, and even though it's more system related and not so much in the media, and it doesn't necessarily have a gender focus, a lot of the work I do, there's such an overrepresentation of youth of color, of people of color at all points in our criminal justice system. And so even though that's been front and center in my mind, I've been thinking about it in a different way than how I was thinking about it in this study. So it's just been a good reminder for me to sort of take a step back and to look at how I'm framing things, and that I still need to calibrate and reframe. I appreciated the opportunity to come here and share this with you. And if any of your viewers have questions or want to learn more about it or need a copy of the paper, I'd be more than happy to send that to them. And so thank you so much for having me here.
Good. And also related to this, we want to share that at one point we like to bring some statisticians, people who deal with data. Some people call them data geeks or so on, in a sense, but to have roundtable discussions on how we can deconstruct data and use it in a much more simplistic way to drive public policy conversations, improvements, because again, our community can only improve. We look at what the data says. And again, sometimes if we're not looking at it, then we're just having socialization parties of patting each other on the back of how good things are, when actual fact they're not as good as they're supposed to be. So really appreciate you being here, Abby, and talking to us about your research, and again, dealing with race and ethnicity, which is one of those things that Moore is very much concerned about and wanted to bring some racial healing into this divided society. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you, A'Jamal.
Good. We've hoped you enjoyed this edition of Moore Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Join us again for another edition. Barocco.